Eyes Are Love. Thank you for being here with this live book reading. So, we've moved into the next chapter of Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare by Vern, Bullough, and Bonnie Bullough. Like we said, this book was written back in the 1970s. And so it's really, really great to go back and see how the patterns have aligned up to where we are right now. And to honor you, I'm your moderator and narrator, Uriel Riley. Peace, everyone. Peace. Chapter 4. The Spanish Speaking Minority Groups. The fastest growing minority groups in the United States are the Spanish speaking peoples from various parts of the Western Hemisphere, particularly Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Although characterized by a common language and grouped together for statistical purposes by their Spanish surnames, these three groups reflect quite different traditions. The largest of the nationality groups, and the one that has been in the United States the longest, is the Mexican Americans, and, or as some of the militants now term themselves, Chicanos. Mexican Americans. Most immigrants to the United States arrive by sea, but the Mexican Americans simply move northward. In fact, many of them lived in the southwestern part of the United States before it became part of this country, or English speaking pioneers moved westward. The closeness of the vast majority of Mexican Americans to their homeland and their unique treaty rights with the United States tend to set them apart from most other immigrants. The Mexican American War, fought between 1846 and 1848, serves as the watershed for the history of the Mexican Americans in the United States. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, executed on February 2nd, 1848, Mexico ceded a vast territory including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and much of Colorado, and also approved the prior annexation of Texas, previously a part of Mexico. The ceded lands represented one half of the territory possessed by Mexico in 1821, when it had gained independence from Spain. According to the provision of the treaty, all citizens of Mexico who decided to remain within the ceded territory were to become citizens of the United States. It is estimated that as a result, some 75,000 Spanish speaking people became American citizens. The treaty also provided specific guarantees for the property and political rights of these Spanish speaking Americans, who were given the right to retain their language, their religion, and their culture. No provision was made for the integration of the peoples as a group into American society, although the treaty did contain a promise of early statehood for the area. California, which had about 7,500 Spanish speaking inhabitants, was quickly admitted into the Union, as was Nevada, which had almost no Spanish speaking residents. Texas, with some 5,000 Spanish Americans, was already a state. New Mexico, with its 60,000 former Mexican nationals, and Arizona, with approximately 1,000, were much slower to receive statehood. One reason for the delay was the fact that neither of these future states had many Anglo American citizens, and American politicians were reluctant to grant full civil rights to a people they considered to be largely illiterate and of an alien culture. The effect of this attitude toward the indigenous Mexican Americans was to retard the assimilation and to encourage the survival of the Spanish cultural influence. Though descendants of these Mexican nationals, as well as later immigrants from Mexico, have all been classified as Spanish speaking Americans, the term at best is a very ambiguous one since Mexico itself was and is home to many different peoples. Citizens of Mexico can be descendants of European settlers, Spanish as well as others, or of the indigenous Indians, or any mixture thereof. In the American Southwest, people with Spanish surnames come from a variety of backgrounds. The mixed nature of this heritage is evident from the city of Los Angeles, which prides itself on its Spanish speaking founders. Of these founders and their wives, two were Spaniards, two were Negroes. Peace, highest heart love. Much love. Thank you for being here, reading with us. We're at the top of page 65. Yes, we are doing it right. Miss Nobody. Highest heart love. Today, the border between Mexico and the United States is some 2,000 miles long, most of it desolate and sparsely populated. Until the Border Patrol of the U.S. Immigration Service was established in 1924, the border could be and was crossed in either direction with comparative ease. Moreover, much of the northern Mexico is geographically separated from southern Mexico by deserts, which meant that the natural market and supply centers for much of the area were in the United States, particularly in those areas which had formerly been part of Mexico. There is also considerable geographical similarity between the southwest part of the United States and the northern Mexico, so that Mexicans who moved north felt more or less at home. Inevitably, there has been considerable movement of Mexicans back and forth across the border, although no one knows for certain the total number of those who crossed over. It is known, however, that in a period before 1900, Mexican nationals played an important part in pioneering new techniques in the gold and silver mining industry, in the western and Pacific states, in the growth of the sugar beet industry, in the development of irrigation, and in the emergence of Texas as a leading cotton growing state. Generally speaking, however, the southwestern part of the United States did not begin to grow very fast until the last decade of the 19th century. This growth has continued through the most of the 20th century. Much of it has been due to the availability of cheap labor, mostly Mexicans who moved northward in large numbers. In the period between 1900 and 1930, it is estimated that some 10% of the total population of Mexico, over a million migrants, crossed into the United States. The Mexican population of Texas, for example, rose from 70,981 in 1910 to 683 681,000 in 1930. It was Mexican labor which built the railroads, dug the irrigation ditches, picked the cotton, cleared the land, and ultimately built the highways opening up the Southwest. This meant that the massive wave of Mexican American immigration coincided in large part with mass exodus to this country of the Russian, Slavic, and Italian immigrants. But the Mexican Americans never were so isolated from their homeland as most others would be citizens, since Mexico, in most cases, was never more than 150 miles away. Peace, everyone. Hi, is heart love. Thank you for reading with us. We are doing it poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare. Seeing all the correlations of the different migrants. And this part is really, really major, right? Especially what we're going through right now. So we're in the section, chapter 4, at the top of page 66. And this chapter is called The Spanish Speaking Minority Groups. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the Mexican migrants settled down in a fan shaped area stretching out from the Mexican border up past Los Angeles to Santa Barbara on the Pacific Ocean and stretching eastward and southward through San Antonio to Corpus Christi on the Gulf of Mexico. Even today, most persons of Mexican descent live in this narrow belt of territory, which includes parts of Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. There has been a remarkable continuity of Mexican family life and customs in this area, in part because most Mexicans who have come north first moved in with relatives. Today, large numbers of Mexican Americans in the southwest United States have relatives across the border, which means there is considerable movement back and forth between the two countries. The extent and concentration of this Mexican migration has tended to make the border rather indistinguishable, with a heavy shading of Mexican Americans near the border, thinning out as it travels north. This shading is on both sides of the border since increasing numbers of people who are not Mexican Americans have retired in Mexico or have winter homes in northern Mexico. Moreover, travel between Mexico and the United States is comparatively easy because the boundary is an imaginary line which is marked only by a barbed wire fence or an easily forded river which often changes its channel. The lack of effective natural border barriers has led to many problems, but it also has tended to lessen the hostility between Mexico and the United States. We do not have the kind of enmity that the Germans and the French who face each other across the Rhine have, but rather there is a sort of gradual fusion between two cultures and people, with the Spanish speaking Americans in the Southwest providing a kind of organic union with the culture and civilization of Mexico. Immigration from Mexico has tended to be in spurts, depending in large part upon the economic conditions in the United States. Much of it has been through contract labor, a term used to describe imported workers whose freedom is restricted by the terms of contractual relations. Though contract labor, except in the case of skilled or professional workers, has been outlawed in the United States since 1885. Various legal ways have been found to circumvent the law. One of the largest loopholes appeared in the immigration law of 1917, which contained a provision allowing the Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization to control and regulate the admission and return of otherwise inadmissible aliens applying for temporary admission. This meant that though contract labor was still outlawed, large numbers of Mexican nationals could be imported into the United States providing the consent of the commissioner was obtained. During the following World War I, some 50,000 workers were known to have been recruited in Mexico, many of whom were sent to northern states, as well as the fields and industries of the Southwest. Mm. Some of the Mexicans who earlier had crossed the border into the United States were also recruited for work in northern states. In 1923, for example, the National Tube Company, an affiliate of U.S. Steel, brought 1,300 Mexicans from Texas to work in its Lorain, Ohio plant. In that same year, Bethlehem Steel imported 1,000 workers from Mexico to work in its plants in Pennsylvania. The Mexican colony in Detroit had its beginnings in 1918, when several hundred Mexicans were brought to work in the automobile industry as student workers, and others from Mexico soon followed. The bulk of Mexicans who came north, however, were recruited originally as farm laborers. It's facts. This is facts. Love, 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 peace. Isn't this good? Right? The changing nature of farming in the United States and the depression of the 1930s created great difficulty. In fact, by 1937, machines had taken over. 90% of the work involved in preparing, bedding, and cultivating the land to produce garden crops, and this meant that farm labor became ever more seasonal, with the greatest demand coming at harvest time. As the Mexicans, many of whom now regarded themselves as Americans, lost their jobs, they attempted to organize and to strike. In the Southwest, there were a number of Mexican led strikes which generally failed. Failure was due in part to the fact that immigration authorities usually deported those workers who were not citizens, while others were intimidated by threats of violence. Moreover, in most of the strikes, Mexican workers stood alone since they were not affiliated with the rest of organized labor. The result was a mass exodus of Mexicans from the United States to Mexico, often aided and encouraged by various governmental agencies. In February 1931, for example, the county of Los Angeles shipped a whole trainload of its residents back to Mexico at a cost of some $77,249.29. Authorities estimated that the county still saved $347,468.41 in relief money. In 1932, more than 11,000 Mexican nationals were repatriated from Los Angeles alone. With the advent of World War II, there was once again a demand for workers, and Mexico seemed to be an obvious source. In May 1942, the United States and Mexico agreed upon the conditions under which Mexicans might be recruited to work in the United States. Imported workers were to be provided free transportation to and from their homes in Mexico, were to be paid subsistence en route, and were not to be used to displace other workers or to lower wages or salary rates, and were to be provided with certain minimum working and living conditions. On September 29th, 1942, the first shipment of 1,500 Mexican braceros, as they were called, arrived in Stockton, California. In 1945 alone, some 120,000 workers were recruited for agricultural employment in the United States, after which they were returned to Mexico. In addition, another 80,000 workers were imported from Mexico to work on maintaining railroad lines. The farm labor importation program came to an end in 1947, but there was still a demand for low-paid agricultural employees, and this demand led to human smuggling rings. To curtail this, Congress in 1952 reviewed and revised the wartime legislation to allow workers to be imported under temporary work permits or visas. In fairly rapid succession, nearly 500,000 workers were imported, the bulk of whom were from Mexico. Since that time, there has been a gradual phasing out of most contract laborers who were not only unpopular with organized labor, but also with the domestic migratory farm workers who felt that they were being used as strike breakers. Mexicans now enter legally under a general quota, which covers all Western Hemisphere countries as immigrants obtain work permits for temporary stay or slip across the border illegally. Illegal immigrants can quickly lose themselves in large ghettos, so called barrios, of Spanish speaking Americans. In 1960, there were 3.5 million persons of Mexican ancestry in the 5 states of Southwest, and this number has now been estimated at 5 million. Since the change in the nature of agriculture and the lessening demand for the farm laborers, the majority of the Mexicans have come to settle in urban areas, with the result that Los Angeles is second only to Mexico City in its total Mexican population. Like the Negroes, the Mexican American is also segregated within the urban complex, although in most of the cities of the Southwest, the housing patterns are not quite so rigidly segregated as those of Negroes. In Los Angeles, for example, there are great barrios which border the city of the East, but there are also large numbers of Mexican Americans scattered throughout the city. Since many people with Spanish surnames have achieved positions of power and influence in the Southwest, discrimination against Mexican Americans tends to be far more subtle than that experienced by Negroes. However, most members of the Mexican American minority are still poor and they still face a large language barrier. Although the immigrant cannot advance to positions of influence in the outside world without learning English, it is possible to live a lifetime in the larger barrios without becoming fluent in English. This means that many of the children from the barrios who go to school are bilingual, speaking Spanish from at home and English at school. This tends to discourage all but the dedicated students from continuing their schooling. Moreover, the fact that many of the Mexicans are in the country illegally makes the Mexican American worker more exploitable because an unscrupulous employer can hire an illegal immigrant and use the threat of exposure over him or his friends or relatives as a power tool in order to pay him less than the minimum wages or to avoid enforcing safety rules. The peasant Mexican American culture, from which most of Mexican Americans derived, also tends to work against easy assimilation into the Anglo American middle class culture. Also, Mexico and United States have, with few exceptions, enjoyed fairly peaceful relationships for over a century, and this has meant that the Mexicans did not have to choose between their mother country and the United States, as some German Americans felt they had to do in World War I. This has made it possible for large numbers of Mexican Americans to live together geographically in the United States, but intellectually and emotionally in the local Mexican tradition. Moreover, Mexico, at least in the period before World War I, was a very poor country, with society so organized that the sense of enterprise, thrift, and the initiative highly valued by Americans was not encouraged. The patron system of land tenure in Mexico was not unlike the Southern plantation system, which meant that the workers or peons were virtually powerless. In societies of this type, money is meaningless, trade is limited, and division of labor is either simple or almost non existent. In Mexico, native folk practices were interwoven with Catholic Church ritual. Inevitably, the Mexican peon could rather easily become confused and demoralized in the American city. Unfortunately, these cultural conditioned traits have often been interpreted as racial or biological. Mm, 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 mm. Let me read that again. Thank you guys for being here. This is lovely. Unfortunately, for these culturally conditioned traits have often been interpreted as racial or biological. The Mexican stereotype is usually one of extremes, either lawless and violent or lacking in ambition and lazy. As a defense against these stereotypes and discrimination in group feeling has developed. While, on the other hand, those Mexicans who have managed to achieve in American society often cut themselves off from their countrymen by emphasizing that they are Spanish instead of facing up to the cultural stereotype of being Mexican. And you know what? We'll pause right here. Give it love, right? That was the part on Mexican Americans. Next, we will go into Puerto Ricans. All right, and I'll pick that back up um, tomorrow. Let's do it, right? Hi, it's Heart Love, guys. That's a pause on page 70 in the middle. All right, here we go. Poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare by Paul Vern Bullough and Bonnie Bullough. I'm your moderator and narrator. Highest heart, love, and honor. We did it again. Thank you guys. Peace. What's that? I like, yes. Yes, this subject matter is thick. Yes, it is. And you know, we so need to be grounded, right? Because again, like I said in that last reading, when we're grounded, we can see our reality and then we can look up from there. When we're floating around not grounded, we think, oh, everything's fine. They just see me as this. Well, the reality is, most people judge a book by its cover. So stay vigilant, be rooted in your self mastery, right? When you know who you are, no one can tell you who you are for you. That's right. Tell our own stories. Yes, right. Man, this is deep. Hey, gems. Highest heart, love, and honor. Happy holidays again. Guys, I will be back soon. All right? Peace, love, and honor. Thank you.